They say history is written by the victors. But what happens to the stories that victors themselves fear to write down? What happens when a single night, a single marriage, a single woman becomes so dangerous, so destabilizing, that the world itself conspires to forget it? Tonight, you're going to hear one of those stories. Before we begin, I want you to do something for me. Like this video, subscribe, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Because what I'm about to share will cross oceans, centuries, and the bloodlines of families you never knew you were connected to. And once you hear it, you cannot return to ignorance. The year was 1824, in a small town whose name has been all but erased from maps. Records suggest it lay in the valley of a place once called Ebonridge, an old settlement swallowed by fog and ruin. And it was here, on a cold winter's evening, that a wedding was prepared unlike any other. The bride, Eleanor Draycott, was a woman of haunting beauty. But more than that, she carried in her veins something unspoken, something that men in power had both feared and desired for generations. Her groom was a man of respectable standing, yet every document that should bear his name has been mysteriously burned or lost. It is as if history wanted him forgotten, while his bride's memory lingered like a shadow in the corner of the eye. The church bells rang that night, echoing across the valley. Witnesses, what few survived long enough to write anything, described a ceremony suffused with dread. The priest's voice cracked. The candles guttered. It was as if the walls themselves resisted the union. But the vows were spoken, the kiss sealed the covenant, and by midnight the celebration reached its peak. Guests dined, drank, and swayed beneath the chandeliers, yet the bride disappeared from the hall without anyone noticing. What happened next would scar that valley forever. At dawn, the bells rang again, but not for festivity. Eleanor Draycott had given birth, not months after her marriage, but on the very night of her wedding. The midwives who attended her whispered of cries that were not the cries of an ordinary child. Some swore the infant had opened its eyes immediately, speaking words no newborn should know. Others claimed the child was not one, but two, one of flesh, one of shadow. The truth remains uncertain because the room was sealed, and those who were allowed inside never spoke the same version twice. Yet one thing is clear. By sunrise, Eleanor was gone. No grave was dug, no body found. She had vanished, leaving behind only the blood-stained linens and the wailing of something that may have been human, or may not have been at all. You see, the story did not end with her disappearance. The men who held power in that valley, priests, judges, landowners, gathered to erase it. Records of the birth were purged, the church burned, the witnesses silenced. But like a disease, rumors spread beyond the valley. Sailors carried them into port cities. Traders whispered them in taverns. And wherever the story traveled, something followed. Disappearances, hauntings, unexplained deaths. It was as if Eleanor Draycott's child was not confined to a cradle, but it spilled into the very bloodstream of history. And so we arrive here, nearly 2 centuries later, daring to speak what others swore never to repeat. The question is not whether the story is true. The question is why those in power tried so desperately to bury it. Because Eleanor Draycott's wedding night was not the end of something. It was the beginning. The child was taken. That much is certain. Accounts suggest that by the second morning, the infant was no longer in the house. Some say it was carried away by priests, swaddled in holy cloths, as they whispered exorcisms and litanies. Others say a group of masked men arrived. Men not from the valley, but from a higher order, cloaked in authority that outstripped both church and crown. These men, it is said, carried not crucifixes but symbols older than Christianity itself. They were not there to banish the child. They were there to claim it. This is the first fracture in the story. Who truly controlled the fate of Eleanor's child? The church claimed the birth was an abomination, yet its officials guarded the details with a loyalty that suggested obedience, not fear. And among the papers that remain, charred fragments found in private collections, handwritten letters smuggled across borders. One phrase returns again and again: the covenant of the bride. What was this covenant? Why did men of power refer to it, as if it had existed long before Eleanor ever drew breath? Some scholars believe it was a ritual pact stretching back centuries, renewed once every few generations through a chosen woman. Others insist it was less mystical and more sinister, a bloodline engineered, manipulated, cultivated by those who understood that power was not just political or financial. It was biological. If you look closely, patterns emerge. Every few decades, a bride would vanish on her wedding night in Europe, in the Americas, in distant colonies whose records are rarely revisited. Always, there were whispers of a child. Always, there were gaps in the archives. And always, those who tried to dig too deep ended in ruin. Their homes burned. Their families struck by accidents. Their names erased from ledgers. You see, this was not about one bride, not even about Eleanor Draycott herself. She was merely the most infamous, the one whose case slipped through the cracks long enough to leave us a trail. But here's what chills me most. The birth on Eleanor's wedding night was not seen as a curse by everyone. In certain letters, you find not fear, but reverence. One surviving priest's confession, written in trembling Latin, reads, "It was not she who gave birth. It was the night itself. The bride was only the vessel." Imagine that. Not a woman bearing a child, but time itself, ritual itself, giving form to something that men have pursued since the dawn of civilization. This is why Eleanor vanished. She was not kidnapped, nor murdered in the conventional sense. She was consumed by the very covenant that had chosen her. Some argue she became the first sacrifice to her own child. Others believe she still walked the earth, veiled, hidden, moving from place to place as an eternal mother of the covenant. But whether she was erased or preserved, the fact remains, her story was not allowed to die, even if her body was. And so we begin to see the contours of the truth, that institutions, both religious and secular, were not simply frightened by Eleanor's child. They were invested in it. They protected it. They nurtured it. And perhaps, even now, the echoes of that night still live among us. Because some families, even today, trace their bloodline back to a nameless bride who vanished after delivering a child. And if their whispers are to be believed, the covenant was never broken. It only waits. The trail of Eleanor Draycott's disappearance should have ended in silence, but silence rarely holds forever. Within months of her vanishing, strange patterns emerged in the valley. Families who had attended the wedding began reporting night terrors so vivid they bordered on possession. Children woke screaming in languages their parents swore they had never heard. Livestock were found mutilated, drained of blood in ways no wolf or thief could explain. And in the parish ledgers, those meticulous books kept by priests, whole pages were torn out. Not simply blotted, not crossed through, but carved away with a blade, as though even ink on parchment was too dangerous a trace of what had occurred. Travelers passing through Ebenridge told of seeing a woman wandering the hills at night, always in white, always barefoot, always silent. She never approached, never beckoned. But those who looked into her face spoke of eyes that seemed too ancient for a bride, eyes that carried centuries of sorrow. Some insisted it was Eleanor herself, condemned to wander until the covenant's demand were fulfilled. Others argued it was not her at all, but a mimic, a shadow wearing her form as a lure. Regardless, those who saw her seldom stayed in the valley for long. But here is where the story twists darker. The church declared the sightings false, the mutilations mere superstition. Yet in a hidden vault in the city of York, a collection of sealed testimony from priests who served in those years, there lies a passage that is almost too precise to dismiss. It states, "The bride walks in two forms, one seen by the common eye, and another seen only in dreams. Beware the latter, for she speaks with a voice not her own." This dream bride became a recurring figure across testimonies. Farmers, soldiers, widows, all dreamed of a veiled woman entering their rooms at night, whispering of a child who would come not once, but many times across generations. She did not ask for devotion. She demanded it. And those who resisted found their health failing, their minds unraveling. Even skeptics who dismissed such claims could not ignore the exodus from Ebbenridge. By 1830, half the valley stood abandoned. By 1840, the church itself collapsed into ruin, its stones scavenged by desperate men who whispered that the walls were too heavy with sins to remain upright. Yet still the covenant endured, because even when the valley emptied, Eleanor's story migrated outward. One by one, other disappearances mirrored hers. A bride in Bavaria, vanishing hours after her vows. A young woman in Virginia, seen with child on her wedding night and never again. A noble family in Prague whose daughter's name was stricken from records the moment she was wed. And each time, rumors swirled of a birth too swift, too unnatural to belong to ordinary flesh. The covenant did not belong to Ebbenridge. It belonged to something older, and Eleanor was only one link in its chain. But what was it binding together? Bloodlines? Rituals? Or something deeper? Something that fed not on faith, but on fear itself? What if every bride who vanished was not stolen by misfortune, but claimed by design? What if their children were not anomalies, but calculated steps in a lineage the world was never meant to see? If you study forbidden archives long enough, you learn to see what's missing. What's been erased leaves an outline of what terrified the erasers. And in the records surrounding Eleanor Draycott, the gaps are deliberate. Consider this. Eleanor's family line, the Draycotts, disappears from land registries within a single decade. Estates confiscated, names redacted, portraits slashed. An entire bloodline made to vanish, as if history itself had been paid to forget. But here's where it gets worse. In certain shipping records from the 1830s, one name keeps surfacing. Vessels chartered under false identities, always carrying special cargo described in vague terms, always bound for distant shores. Cross-reference those with surviving letters from colonial outposts, and the picture sharpens. Women arriving under guard, pregnant or already mothers, hidden in convents or estates far from prying eyes. The covenant was expanding. What began in a forgotten valley was now a network. The so-called bride was not one woman, but many, spread across continents, concealed under layers of secrecy enforced by both church and crown. Some are buried alive in rituals mistaken for funerals. Others were kept in houses that doubled as prisons, guarded by men who carried both scripture and daggers. And wherever these women appeared, so too did disappearances, whispers of stillborns that breathed, of infants that aged years and days, of children who died only to be seen again in places far away. It was no longer about Eleanor. She was simply the most visible fracture in a system that had operated for centuries. But by breaking through the veil of secrecy, she revealed the architecture of the covenant, a machine that used women as vessels, weddings as gates, and blood as currency. Do you see how dangerous this is? If marriages could be corrupted, if vows themselves were exploited to birth something beyond human, then the institution of family, the foundation of society, was never what it seemed. Perhaps it was never designed to be sacred at all, but to serve a darker purpose. Perhaps the covenant of marriage was never about love or unity. Perhaps it was about control. The greatest trick institutions ever played was convincing us that rituals like weddings were purely human celebrations. But in the shadows, beneath the lace and vows, a transaction was taking place. One older than the church, older than kingdoms, older even than Scripture. Eleanor Draycott's wedding was simply the one that cracked the mask wide enough for us to glimpse what lay beneath. And once you glimpse it, you cannot unsee it. They tried to make Eleanor's story vanish, but vanishing is never perfect. The traces that remain are not in books or paintings, but in whispers carved into the margins of history, in fragments of testimony smuggled under threat of death. One fragment, found in a private collection in Lisbon, describes the covenant not as a pact between man and God, but as a marriage between flesh and something older, a union of humanity with a force that lived before temples, before kings, before even language itself. The bride was not chosen by chance. She was selected, prepared, and delivered like an offering. And this is where the story bleeds into something far larger. Across civilizations, across eras, we find the same archetype, the sacred bride who vanishes, the woman who carries within her a child that is not hers alone. In Mesopotamian tablets, in Egyptian hymns, in obscure Celtic chants, you find echoes of this figure, a woman married not to a man, but to the void itself. They called her by different names, but the pattern is identical. She disappears, and the lineage of rulers, priests, or kings that follow claim legitimacy from her blood. What if Eleanor Draycott was not the beginning, but the continuation of this chain? What if her wedding night was merely another chapter in a lineage that has always operated just beyond the edge of visibility, claiming bride after bride to renew its power? You must understand, power never sustains itself through force alone. True power sustains itself through rituals, through symbols, through acts so deeply embedded in culture that no one dares question them. And what ritual is more universal, more unquestioned than marriage? You attend the wedding, you smile, you eat, you drink, and yet you do not see what is being transacted. Vows spoken before witnesses are not for love. They are contracts written in the very fabric of society, binding the bride to something she can never truly escape. But in Eleanor's case, the contract was forced open. Something slipped through, and that something could not be hidden forever. Because after her vanishing, those who survived began to see a child. A boy, some said. A girl, others insisted. Some swore they saw him running in the fields, though no one had ever seen him grow. Some swore she sat at their table, silent, never aging. A child without time, a child without place. The covenant had succeeded and failed. It had delivered something, yes, but it could not contain it. This is the terror, that the covenant is not only real, but fragile. That when it falters, reality itself begins to bleed. That be why the middle of the 19th century, the pattern could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Wherever the covenant spread, the institutions of power grew stronger and darker. In Ireland, whole villages were emptied after the wedding of a single girl whose name has been struck from every registry. In Italy, cloisters built to house fallen brides became sites of mass graves, their walls painted over with holy scenes to mask the decay beneath. And in New England, newly married women began disappearing into sanatoriums, where doctors wrote of hysterical births, infants that lived for minutes, hours, or days before being taken away by men who refused to give their names. These fragments do not exist in isolation. They form a map. And when you trace that map, the shape it forms is unmistakable, a network of power reaching across continents, feeding on the same ritual. The bride, the child, the disappearance, and always the silence that follows. But silence is never innocent. Silence is engineered. To silence witnesses, you need institutions. You need churches, courts, doctors, governments, all complicit in burying the evidence. That is what makes this covenant so dangerous. It is not a cult operating on the fringes. It is a system operating from a center, using the most sacred ritual we know, marriage, as its disguise. Think about this. When you attend a wedding, what do you see? A priest or officiant invoking a higher power. Families gathered, binding themselves to a new bloodline. Vows exchanged, promising obedience, fidelity, sacrifice. And at the center, the bride, always veiled, always given away, always offered. She is not the focus. She is the vessel. Eleanor Draycott's story is not simply terrifying because of what she birthed. It is terrifying because it exposes the ritual beneath every wedding you have ever seen. A ritual that binds not just two people, but entire generations into a cycle they do not understand. And once you see that, you begin to notice the cracks. The coldness in ceremonies, the trembling in brides' hands, the way some vanish from records as though they never lived. Eleanor was not unique. She was one of many, and her disappearance was not an accident. It was the covenant claiming what it was always owed. So ask yourself, how many brides have vanished that we never even noticed? There is a truth that the world recoils from, a truth too corrosive for polite society, yet lingers in the archives like a stain that will not wash away. Marriage itself was never designed for love. That is the story they tell us to keep us docile, to keep us blind. But beneath that veneer lies the covenant, a transaction between powers, sealed with the life of the bride. Eleanor Draycott's fate was simply the crack in the mask, but the ritual is older, wider, and far more deliberate than anyone dares admit. Evidence emerges where it should not. A missionary's diary in Bengal, 1847, records a wedding where the bride convulsed at the altar before delivering a stillborn child that the officiant immediately carried away. In Prague, an aristocratic family refused to speak their daughter's name after her wedding day. Yet in their private chapel, painted behind layers of plaster, was a mural of a veiled woman holding a child with no face. And in Mexico, an entire town celebrates a festival where no bride wears white, because long ago, one who did vanished before dawn, leaving only a blood-stained veil in her bed. These are not scattered oddities. They are fractures in a hidden structure, a network of rituals stretching across continents, hidden under the sanctity of marriage. They tell you weddings are about beginnings. In truth, they're about endings, the ending of a woman's autonomy, the ending of her family line as her blood is given over, the ending of her role as a free being and her binding as a vessel. Do you see it yet? Eleanor's story is terrifying because it is visible, but far more terrifying is the possibility that hundreds, thousands of other women were claimed in silence, their names erased, their children harvested into the machinery of power. How many of our leaders, how many of our rulers, how many of our kings and priests and presidents trace their blood back to a bride who never returned from her wedding night? When you look at history through this lens, patterns emerge that are impossible to unsee. Dynasties that rise not through conquest, but through sudden, inexplicable legitimacy. Families that appear from nowhere, with wealth and influence beyond reason. Leaders whose very presence instills fear, even reverence, as though something beyond human blood flows through their veins. The covenant is not only about creating children. It is about creating heirs. Heirs who serve no nation, no faith, no people. Heirs who serve the covenant itself. And so we must return to Eleanor Draycott, for she was not merely a victim. She was a catalyst. Her wedding night cracked the veil because too many saw what they were never meant to see. A child delivered not after months, but hours. A woman who vanished without a trace. And a silence so carefully enforced that even centuries later, we only have fragments. But fragments can be more damning than whole records. In one burned letter, salvaged from a rectory in Bath, a priest wrote in desperation, "The bride delivered what was promised, but the vessel refused the binding. She walked still, unclaimed." Imagine what that means. Eleanor did not die. She did not submit. She resisted. And in resisting, she became dangerous not just to herself, but to the covenant itself. This explains why sightings of her, or of something wearing her likeness, persisted for decades. Women in white wandering the edges of towns, appearing at windows, reflected in mirrors. Always silent, always watching. Was this Eleanor, broken free from her role, or was this the covenant's mimic, a shadow sent to remind the world that the ritual still holds power? Perhaps both. Perhaps once a bride becomes the vessel, she is no longer one woman, but many, a fragment that can reappear across time, across continents, wherever the covenant requires her presence. Consider the implications. If Eleanor could resist, even for a moment, then perhaps others did too. Perhaps not every bride vanished into silence. Perhaps some fled, carrying with them the bloodline, the secret, the seed of the covenant. That would explain the scattered stories of children who appear unnatural, uncanny, uncontainable. Children who grow too fast or not at all. Children who die yet are seen again, unchanged, decades later. Children who become leaders, prophets, tyrants, reshaping history in ways that defy explanation. Eleanor's defiance, whether deliberate or accidental, exposed the frailty of the covenant. And frailty breeds desperation. From that point onward, the rituals grew more violent, more secretive, more guarded by institutions that could no longer risk another crack in the mask. Convents became prisons. Weddings became stage performances. And women were groomed, selected, chosen, not for beauty or wealth, but for bloodlines no one was permitted to trace. What they feared most was not that the covenant would be discovered. What they feared was that brides like Eleanor would resist, and in resisting, reveal to the world that the ritual could be broken. And if it could be broken, then perhaps it could be destroyed. The covenant feeds not on faith, not even on obedience, but on continuity. Break the chain, and its power falters. That is why Eleanor Draycott's disappearance was so dangerous. She was not erased neatly. She was not buried beneath stone and scripture. She lingered, and in her lingering, she exposed the weakness of a system that demands silence. But silence was not absolute. In the decades after her vanishing, fragments of testimony began surfacing in places far removed from Ebonridge. A merchant in Cairo swore he met a veiled woman who handed him a bundle of cloth, within which lay a lock of hair he claimed never grew dull or decayed. A fisherman in Venice swore that on his wedding night, a woman in white appeared at the foot of his bed and whispered, "You are not marrying her. You are marrying us." And in the records of a monastery in Spain, a monk scribbled in the margin of a psalm, "The bride walks again. She does not age. She seeks the child. Do you hear it?" These are not random stories. They are reverberations, echoes of Eleanor's covenant. It spread outward, infecting not only women but entire communities. Weddings became sites of dread. A veil no longer symbolized purity but shroud. And the fear was not simply of death, but of disappearance, of being taken into a system that no one dared name aloud. Historians, of course, laugh. They dismiss these fragments as hysteria, as the ramblings of peasants and priests. But ask yourself, why then were whole villages wiped from registries? Why were records destroyed with such precision that only certain names, certain dates, certain births vanished? Erasure is not random. It is targeted. And the covenant knew exactly what had to be erased to protect itself. But what a child! That, above all, remains the deepest wound in this story. Did Eleanor's child survive? Was it claimed by priests, by masked men, by the covenant itself? Or did it escape with her, wandering the earth as a figure too dangerous to confine? The answers are buried, but one fact returns again and again. Wherever rumors of the child surface, institutions grow suddenly stronger. Families rise. Orders form. Armies march with uncanny unity, as though the child itself, or its bloodline, was the seed of power planted again and again across the world. And if that is true, then the covenant was not only about birth. It was about empire. It is here that the story crosses into forbidden territory, the point where history, myth, and religion converge into something institutions would rather you never connect. Across cultures, across eras, the same figure emerges, the mother who disappears, the child who inherits the world. In Sumerian myth, she is Inanna, delivering a divine heir who vanishes into the underworld. In Hebrew scripture, she becomes Lilith, the woman cast out for refusing the binding. In medieval Europe, she lingers as the veiled bride who slips away from the altar, leaving behind not a corpse, but a legend. And what of Eleanor Draycott? She is simply the 19th century incarnation of this archetype, the latest vessel in a lineage that stretches back before memory. What makes her dangerous is not that she was chosen, but that she was remembered. Too much of her story survived. Too many saw. Too many whispered. And those whispers became cracks in the wall of silence that the covenant had built for centuries. There is one surviving letter, smuggled from the Vatican's archives by a nameless monk in the late 19th century, that states bluntly, "The bride delivered what was promised, but the covenant fears her defiance. If she walks still, then the covenant is incomplete. And if incomplete, it can be undone." This is why Eleanor's name still lingers in fragments. This is why sightings of her persisted. She was not erased because she could not be. Her defiance made her dangerous in a way no bride before her had been. She revealed the possibility that the covenant was not eternal, not indestructible, but fragile, reliant on obedience, reliant on silence, reliant on fear. And when fear falters, when silence breaks, power crumbles. But power does not crumble willingly. To preserve itself, the covenant adapted. Weddings grew more elaborate, more public, more celebrated. Veils grew thicker. Vows grew stricter. And the institution of marriage itself became untouchable, shielded from critique by centuries of conditioning. To question marriage was to question society itself. That was the genius of the covenant. It hid in plain sight, convincing us all that what we witnessed was sacred when in truth it was sacrifice. Eleanor Draycott's story was never only about her. It was about the system she exposed, the ritual buried inside every wedding we have ever attended, every vow ever spoken, every bride ever veiled. And if she resisted, even once, then perhaps others can resist too. The wedding chamber was prepared as though for a queen. Silks draped from ceiling beams, candles burning in tall iron holders, and a bed dressed in crimson. Yet the silence within was not of joy or desire. It was the silence of a cage. The bride lay trembling, her hands clutching the sheets, her body breaking under forces no mortal woman should endure. Witnesses stationed discreetly nearby later confessed that the air itself seemed to thicken, as though walls of invisible hands pressed inward upon the chamber. Then came the cries, not of pleasure, nor even of fear, but of something ancient being born into flesh. They swore the very stones trembled when the sound rose. The child arrived in darkness, not in light. The midwives who had been summoned against custom, for no bride was expected to give birth on her wedding night, carried lanterns, their faces pale and trembling. What they pulled from the bride's body was not the fragile infant one would expect, but something fully formed, silent, staring with eyes too open for a newborn. A boy, strong, yet wrong. He did not weep. He did not gasp for breath. His chest rose and fell with the steady calm of one who had always been breathing. The women crossed themselves, then stopped, as if afraid such a sign would draw punishment. For the child's gaze moved to them, as though he judged. The groom stood frozen, pale, his hand gripping the doorway. Some claim he fell to his knees, whispering prayers that belonged not to the church but to older, buried names. Others insist he tried to flee, only to be held back by a force none could see. The bride, drained and silent, stared at the ceiling, her lips moving soundlessly, as though repeating a vow no priest had sanctioned. The boy, wrapped in linen, was carried away not to a cradle, but to a locked chest. The sound of its closing rang out like a verdict. Whispers began instantly. Some said the boy was no child at all, but the returned form of a man long dead, smuggled back into the world through the bride's blood. Others believed he was a curse placed by the family's rivals, though no sorcery of rivals could explain the silence of priests who should have intervened. Whatever the truth, those present swore one thing above all, that the bride's expression, faint but certain, was not of horror, but of recognition, as though she had expected him. The child grew, but not as children do. The chest in which he had been hidden was opened each dawn, and the boy emerged without the haze of sleep. He walked before he crawled, he spoke before he babbled, and his first words were not to his mother, but to the patriarch of the family, whispered phrases in a tongue no servant recognized. The patriarch fell pale, kissed the boy's forehead, and decreed that the household would obey his guidance in all matters concerning the child. The bride watched in silence, her lips always moving as if reciting some endless prayer only she could hear. What unsettled the servants most was the boy's refusal of food. No bread, no broth, no milk. His nourishment came from the dark ritual of nights when the household was ordered to remain in their quarters. The sound of chanting echoed faintly through the halls, and once a maid swore she saw crimson liquid dripping from beneath the chamber door. She fled, but was found days later, drowned in the river with her hands bound in prayer knots. The family declared it an accident. Rumors spread to the town. Mothers clutched their children when the boy was carried through the streets, his face expressionless, his gaze too steady. Some claimed animals recoiled from him, yet others swore they saw birds following him in perfect silence, as though awaiting command. The church was called to intervene. A priest arrived, stern, prepared to confront corruption. He lasted one night in the mansion. At dawn, he was escorted away with vacant eyes, repeating a single phrase: "He is chosen, he is chosen." He resigned from the parish the next day and vanished. Still the bride remained silent, her body weakening but her presence unyielding. She never touched the boy, never spoke to him, and yet, each time he entered the room, her eyes filled with tears that burned rather than softened. Some believed she was victim, others accomplice. But those who looked closer claimed they saw something more terrifying in her expression: pride. And so, a question began to rot through the town like a poison. Had the bride been the vessel of corruption, or its willing gatekeeper? And worse still, if the boy was no ordinary child, then what force had demanded such a birth? And how long had the family been preparing for it in silence? The patriarch grew bolder with each passing season, as though the boy's existence had fortified his grip over the family and the town alike. No decree from him was questioned, no refusal tolerated. Those who once mocked the mansion's superstitions now found themselves attending late-night gatherings on the estate grounds, where lanterns burned with blackened wicks and chants echoed in rhythms not heard in churches. The boy sat at the center of these gatherings, silent, his eyes glowing faintly in the lamplight. The patriarch would kneel before him, and soon others followed. Yet not all bent willingly. A few of the town's oldest families, proud and stubborn, whispered of rebellion. They gathered in taverns, speaking in hushed voices of confronting the patriarch, of seizing the boy and delivering him to the church for judgment. But those plans dissolved when their cattle were found bloodless in their fields, their wells poisoned with ash, and their firstborn struck with fevers that no healer could soothe. Coincidence was denied. The message was clear. Defiance carried its cost. By winter, the rebellion was ash and silence. It was then the bride herself began to change. Her body weakened to the point of near transparency. She rarely walked unaided, her face pale as wax, her voice never raised. But when the boy entered her chamber, those who saw claimed she grew momentarily strong. Her spine straightened, her eyes sharpened. It was as though the child drained life from her and returned it when he willed. Some whispered that he was no son at all, but her master, reborn in smaller flesh. The most damning rumors spread from servants who claimed the bride had been groomed since girlhood for this fate. They said she had been taken from her parents young, chosen by the family not for her beauty or wealth, but for her bloodline. There were whispers of records, genealogies that traced her descent not from nobility or saintly figures, but from heretics burned centuries earlier, witches whose names had been erased from Scripture. The implication was monstrous, that her marriage had not been a union of love or even politics, but a ritual sealed by womb and blood, designed to birth something old into new flesh. Still the boy grew. He was not yet a man, but already he spoke with authority that silenced elders. His words spread like commands woven into the air. He ordered a wing of the mansion sealed, and though no one entered again, strange noises bled through stone, the sound of chains dragging, the murmur of voices chanting from beneath the floors. At times, cries echoed, cut short by silence. The mansion, once a place of gatherings and dances, became a fortress of shadows. And at its center, the boy, and the mother who birthed him into a world unprepared by the time he reached his 13th year. The boy had become the axis upon which all power turned. The patriarch no longer spoke at gatherings. He merely bowed his head when the boy raised his hand. Servants no longer dared meet his eyes. Men who once ruled the town's council deferred to him without question. He did not beg for authority. It seemed to rise naturally from his presence, as though every soul around him was tethered by unseen threads. The bride, now fragile to the point of near death, was wheeled through the halls in silence. And yet, those who saw her claimed she smiled faintly whenever the boy commanded. No longer tears, no longer dread, only satisfaction, as though her suffering had reached its purpose. A nurse who tended her swore the bride once whispered, "I was chosen, as was he, and what is chosen cannot be undone." When the nurse attempted to repeat this confession to the priesthood, her body was found days later, hanging from the rafters of her own home, her tongue nailed to the wall beside her. The boy's 13th birthday brought a gathering unlike any other. Nobles arrived in carriages from distant towns, their banners hidden, their faces veiled. The mansion blazed with torches, but the air was heavy with the smell of burning herbs none could name. Witnesses swore the celebration was no feast but a consecration. The boy was seated at the head of a long table, crowned not with gold, but with a circlet of woven thorns. His hand rested upon a tome bound in leather that appeared older than the house itself. When he opened it, the torches flickered as though recoiling. The bride sat beside him, skeletal yet unyielding, her hand resting upon his shoulder. At the stroke of midnight, the boy rose and spoke words that none present would repeat, words that seemed to shake loose the mortar between the stones, words that left those who heard them bleeding from their ears. Yet no one fled. They all knelt, trembling, as though compelled. Some claimed the boy was no longer a boy at all, that his shadow stretched across the hall, towering over men thrice his size. When dawn broke, the guest departed pale, silent, and forever changed. None spoke of what had transpired, but their actions told the story. Every one of them ceded power, lands, or wealth to the patriarch's house within months. It was as if the boy had woven chains of silence and loyalty around their souls. Still, the question lingered, unspoken yet gnawing. How long before this power extended beyond the walls of the mansion, beyond the town, beyond the land itself? And what, if anything, remained of the bride who had given everything, perhaps even her soul, to bring him here? The town no longer recognized itself. What once bustled with trade, laughter, and ordinary quarrels had become hushed and watchful, every eye drawn to the mansion looming above. Its windows never closed, and at night, pale candlelight flickered in patterns that seemed too deliberate, as though signaling unseen watchers beyond the hills. The people whispered, but not too loudly. For those who spoke against the boy, now called by many only the heir, often vanished before sunrise. Some were found days later, wandering the fields without memory, muttering fragments of prayers that made no sense. Others were never seen again, their homes left unlocked, their meals half-eaten. The bride's presence became increasingly spectral. Rarely did she leave her chamber, and when she did, she was wheeled into the hall only during ceremonies that revolved around her son. She did not speak, but when her gaze swept over the assembly, it silenced even the boldest. Witnesses claimed her body had grown so frail that her skin clung to her bones like parchment. Yet her eyes, deep, dark, knowing, had only grown stronger. Some swore that when they met her gaze, they felt as though she were still in control, that she was the true architect, even while her body decayed. Meanwhile, the heir's demands grew stranger. He ordered wells dug in places where no water could ever be found. He insisted on bonfires built at crossroads, where families were forced to burn offerings of grain, livestock, even blood. The church dispatched inquiries, but each envoy who arrived was absorbed into the estate, only to emerge transformed, deferential, their voices flat, their souls seemingly hollowed. Soon the church stopped sending anyone at all. The silence was damning. It meant only one thing. What the heir represented was not opposed, but quietly permitted. The townspeople began to understand that their lives were no longer their own. The boy's voice seemed to weave into their dreams, instructing, commanding, shaping them into submission. At first they resisted, but over time, resistance felt unnatural. Families who had once clung to their faith began to forsake church bells, replacing them with whispered oaths beneath the moon. Children began to play games in imitation of rituals they had never been taught, as though the knowledge was growing within them like weeds through stone. And yet, no matter how far the corruption spread, all roads of dread led back to the bride. For in her silent suffering, there was no resistance. There was only a chilling certainty, a quiet acceptance that made even the most hardened men tremble. The people began to suspect that she had not merely delivered a child, she had delivered a master. And in doing so, she had rewritten their fate, binding them to a shadow that grew darker with every passing year. The mansion's sealed wing remained a place of terror. None dared approach, yet everyone knew something moved behind those locked doors. On windless nights, cries bled through the stone, inhuman yet agonized, as though dozens of voices begged for release. Chains clattered, doors boomed, and once, a flash of light brighter than lightning burst through the cracks of the windows, leaving the surrounding earth scorched. The air never explained what dwelled there. He only smiled when questioned, a smile that silenced any further inquiry. It was the bride who betrayed the truth, not through words, but through ritual. One winter's eve, the household gathered for a ceremony at the boy's command. The hall was lined with black banners, stitched with symbols no seamstress in town could have created. The air was thick with incense that burned the lungs, leaving all who breathed it dizzy, disoriented. The boy sat at the head of the table, crowned again with thorns. At his side sat the bride, her skin pale as bone, her veins dark as rivers of ink beneath the flesh. As the ritual unfolded, the bride lifted her fragile hand and traced shapes upon the table in her own blood. The shapes matched the banners, and in that instant, all understood she was not merely the vessel. She was the key, the sealed wing, the cries, the strange rituals. They were tethered not only to the boy's will, but to the sacrifice of her body, her blood. It was through her that the gates to something greater had been pried open. The crowd fell to its knees. Some wept, others convulsed. A few clawed at their own skin as though something within them sought escape. The heir watched in silence, unblinking. Then, as if in reward, he bent and pressed his lips to his mother's forehead. Her body shuddered violently, her bones cracking audibly, yet she did not scream. Her eyes widened with what could only be described as rapture. For a moment, the room swore they saw her shadow separate from her body, rising tall and vast against the wall. Not a woman's shadow at all, but something crowned, something ancient. And then the torches guttered, plunging the hall into darkness. When they flared again, the bride sat motionless, her head bowed, her lips curved in a faint smile that chilled every heart. The heir raised his hand, and silence reigned. Whatever they had witnessed was never spoken of again. But each person who left the mansion that night knew one thing without doubt. The bride had not given all she had yet. She had only begun. By spring, the town no longer murmured of rebellion. Its people had become docile, their eyes hollow, their words empty of resistance. The heir's will was their compass, and his shadow reached into every home, every prayer, every silence. But there was one night when his grip over them was laid bare. The bells of the church rang at midnight, though no hand pulled their ropes. Windows shattered, dogs howled in unison, and the people awoke, not in panic, but in compulsion, drawn like moths to the square before the mansion. There, beneath the flickering lanterns, the bride was brought forth. Her body was frail as a skeleton, swaddled in black veils, her head crowned with a circlet of dried flowers that crumbled to dust as she moved. Yet her eyes were alive with fire. She was wheeled before the gathering, and the heir, standing beside her, raised a hand. The crowd fell to its knees instantly. It was then the heir spoke of a covenant sealed not by faith nor by church, but by blood willingly given. He commanded them to swear their silence to the world beyond, to keep what they had witnessed as theirs alone. His voice was not the voice of a boy. It carried the weight of centuries, the resonance of something no longer bound to flesh. And the bride nodded, her lips finally parting. She whispered a phrase, soft, ancient, yet every soul in the square heard it clearly. That phrase must not be forgotten. If you are watching now, if you hear the weight of this truth pressing upon you, you must type it twice in the comments, exactly as you see it, The circle is sealed. Again, let your fingers lock it into the world. The circle is sealed. For only then do you carry the burden. Only then do you show you are not merely a spectator, but a witness bound to this forbidden history. The crowd that night repeated the words until their throats bled. And as dawn rose, not a single voice strayed from the vow. They were no longer a town, but a congregation, a vessel for something larger. And from her chair, the bride smiled faintly, her body dying, her purpose fulfilled, yet her spirit tethered to the covenant she had sealed with them all. But not all hearts bent willingly. Among the masses, a few held back, men whose blood still carried fire, women who whispered prayers to saints even as they knelt in the square. They kept their silence, but their souls fought against the weight of the heir's command. And it was these few who bore the brunt of what followed. Within weeks, calamities fell upon their homes. Fields that once yielded grain withered overnight, their stalks twisted black. Infants wailed without pause, their eyes glazed as though staring into something no one else could see. Husbands went mad, carving circles into the walls of their homes until their hands were raw. Wives wandered barefoot into the woods, singing the forbidden phrase in voices not their own. By summer, the dissenters had either vanished, bent, or been broken. The heir had no need for soldiers. His power reached into the marrow of those who opposed him, reshaping them from within. And all the while, the bride's body wasted further, until she was little more than a whisper of skin and bone. Yet still she lingered, tethered to life not by flesh but by purpose. Some claimed they saw her shadow walking the halls, even when her body lay motionless in her chamber. Others swore she appeared in dreams, her lips moving in silence, as though guiding them toward submission. One night, during a gathering in the great hall, the heir lifted the withered hand of his mother and placed it upon the tome of leather that never left his side. The air froze. Every flame bent inward, pulled as if toward an unseen void. Then the bride spoke aloud, her voice breaking from decades of silence. "It is open," she said, 3 words that shivered through every soul present. Her head fell back, her eyes turned upward, and for the first time in years, her lips curved not in pride, but in pure ecstasy. The heir closed the tome with a single hand, and the sound was not the sound of paper and leather, but of stone grinding against stone. The sealed wing shook violently, its chains rattling, doors booming as though something within answered her words. And the people knew, whatever she had opened, it was no mere chamber. It was a gate, and gates, once opened, never close without a price. The ground itself seemed to rebel against the bride's declaration. Earthquakes split the cobblestones of the courtyard. Fountains turned red as though fed from veins beneath the soil, and the air hung thick with the stench of iron. But within the mansion, no one screamed, no one fled. They watched as the heir stood beside his mother, unshaken, as though the chaos outside had been nothing more than a herald of their triumph. And in that silence, they understood, this was not the beginning of madness. This was the order they had always been moving toward. The sealed wing no longer remained sealed. Its doors, once bound by rusted chains, hung wide, though no servant had touched them. Those who dared glance into its depths swore they saw nothing, and yet their eyes watered as if staring into smoke. Their ears rang as though listening to unearthly bells. From that night onward, figures were seen moving within those halls, though no faces could be described. They were taller than men, yet too thin, shadows that seemed to breathe. When the heir passed by, they bowed. When the bride's chair was wheeled near, they trembled as though recognizing their queen. Whispers spread of sacrifices demanded within the wing. At first, animals, goats, dogs, blackbirds gathered from woods. Then prisoners, criminals pulled from town jails under cover of night. But soon, servants began disappearing, their absence unacknowledged by the household. The people whispered that their screams echoed faintly at dawn, muffled beneath layers of stone. Some claimed to see blood seep through the cracks of the mansion walls, absorbed again as if the house itself fed upon it. And the bride, she did not falter. Though her body was nearly gone, her spirit seemed to bloom like a flower fed by the suffering of others. Those who caught her eyes in candlelight swore they felt gratitude pour from her, as though she thanked them for offering their flesh to her son's purpose. She had become something more than human, less than divine, a bridge forever suspended between the two. But it was the heir's transformation that shook even the most devoted. His voice deepened into tones no child could speak. His body, though still small, carried the weight of command greater than kings. At times, those near him claimed to see his features flicker, his shadow, growing antlers, his eyes glowing as if lit from within. And with each passing day, it became clearer. The boy was not merely her child. He was a vessel filled, a throne occupied by something ancient. And the bride had given him not just birth, but invitation. By now, the town was little more than an annex of the mansion's will. Priests who once tried to rouse resistance now knelt in silence during blackened rites. Farmers who once labored under the sun now worked by moonlight, offering their harvest not to market, but to the altar in the courtyard. The children sang songs not of saints, but of circles, gates, and crowns of thorns. The old faith had not merely been replaced. It had been erased, devoured by the heir's ascension and the bride's lingering devotion. One night, during a gathering that drew nobles from across the provinces, the heir revealed his full dominion. Seated upon a throne carved from a single block of black stone, his hands rested upon the tome his mother had once bloodied. The bride sat beside him, more spectre than woman, her skin translucent, her voice reduced to faint murmurs only he seemed to hear. Before the guests, the heir raised the tome and opened it wide. The hall grew darker, not from extinguished flames, but from the swallowing of light itself. The guests collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads, screaming, as visions poured into them. Visions of towers built of bone, of seas of ash, of a sky turned red beneath a crown of horns. Some clawed their faces until they were unrecognizable. Others begged to be blinded. But when the darkness receded, every one of them rose renewed, their will shattered, their loyalty absolute. And then the heir spoke, his voice reverberating through stone as though the mansion itself breathed with him. He declared that the covenant was no longer local, no longer bound to a single town. It was to spread outward into cities, into kingdoms, until no altar stood that was not his. He raised his hand, and the bride echoed the gesture. Her fingers trembled, her skin cracked, but her eyes blazed with fire. And when their hands moved together, those present swore they saw a second shadow rise behind them, vast, crowned, draped in black. The heir smiled, the bride wept, and the guests trembled in awe. But beneath their awe lay terror, for they knew the covenant had no end. What had begun with a forbidden wedding night had now grown into a force that would bleed across nations. And in that moment, it was clear the bride had not disappeared at all. She had only become eternal through the child she had birthed, and through the gate she had opened with her blood. The farther the covenant spread, the more the mansion itself seemed to breathe. Its stones pulsed faintly under torchlight. Its corridors whispered with echoes of prayers no servant dared repeat. Carriages bearing strangers with veiled faces arrived at all hours, their occupants vanishing inside for days before leaving transformed, their eyes glazed with a dark devotion. The town that had once feared the house now welcomed its shadow, for they no longer lived as individuals. They lived as limbs of a single body, extensions of the heir's will. And yet, within that unity, the bride's form decayed further. She was wheeled through halls with her head bowed, her breath shallow, her bones visible beneath parchment skin. But when the heir spoke, she lifted her head, and the faintest smile pulled her lips, a smile not of frailty, but of completion. Some whispered that her body remained only because he willed it so, that she had already crossed beyond, her soul tethered to the house, her essence feeding its walls. In hushed voices, they called her the veil, the membrane between their world and what lay clawing at its edges. The sealed wing grew louder with each passing season. Cries rose like hymns, chains dragged endlessly, and shadows lengthened even in daylight. Farmers reported seeing silhouettes pacing in their fields at night, their limbs impossibly long, their heads crowned with antlers or veils. Cattle were found bloodless, their hides stitched with symbols the heir himself drew upon the altar. The priests had long since abandoned the cross, kneeling now before the gate itself. Their sermons a mixture of scripture and blasphemy, twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Those few who retained scraps of resistance whispered that the bride's suffering was endless, that she had not disappeared, but become trapped in an eternal state, neither alive nor dead, her torment feeding the covenant. They claimed her wedding had been no union at all, but a binding of womb and blood to bring forth a vessel that would tear the veil between worlds. But these whispers never lasted long, for the heir, though still a youth, moved as though he heard every thought, saw every secret. Those who doubted, too, openly simply ceased to exist, as though their names had been cut from the fabric of memory. Still, a question lingered, pressing upon even the most loyal hearts. When her body finally failed, when the bride's last breath slipped from her lips, what would happen? Would the heir rise fully unshackled? Or would the gate, fed by her blood and her agony, finally open wide enough to swallow them all? The answer began to unfold on a night when the sky refused to darken. The sun bled red across the horizon, but never set, as though time itself had stalled. The town gathered outside the mansion, summoned not by voice but by compulsion. They stood motionless, eyes fixed upon the upper windows where faint candlelight flickered. Inside, the bride lay upon her deathbed, her breath shallow, her chest rising with unbearable effort. The heir sat beside her, one hand upon hers, the other resting upon the tomb. Witnesses swore they heard a sound like thunder within the sealed wing. Doors slammed, walls cracked, and the mansion stones groaned as if straining to contain what had been growing within. The people outside knelt as one, though none had been commanded. They bowed their heads, yet still they saw, in their minds, in their bones, the image of the bride lying in her final hour, and the air whispering to her words no human tongue had formed. At midnight, the bells of the abandoned church tolled 13 times. On the 13th toll, the bride opened her eyes wide. For the first time in years, she did not smile. She wept. Her tears ran black, staining the pillow, soaking the sheets. And then, with a shudder that cracked her brittle bones, she released her final breath. The sound echoed through the mansion like a storm breaking, carrying with it a silence deeper than death. But her death was no release. As her chest stilled, her shadow rose from her body, stretching impossibly tall against the walls, crowned, veiled, and radiant with darkness. It walked toward the heir, who did not flinch, who did not rise, but who only opened the tomb wider. The shadow bent over him, merged with him, and for a moment, those who watched claimed they saw the boy's face split into two, his own and hers, fused in terrible symmetry. The people outside collapsed in unison, clutching their heads, vomiting, weeping, as though their bodies could not contain what had just transpired. And in that agony, they understood the truth. The bride had not disappeared. She had become eternal, her essence swallowed by the air, her sacrifice the final key to the gate she had opened with her womb. And now, with her gone, the heir was no longer tethered by her frailty. He was complete. He was crowned. He was unchallenged. And the covenant, once sealed in secret, was now free to spread without limit. You can silence a town, you can burn its records, you can bury the memory of a woman in consecrated soil and pretend her story never happened. But you cannot erase the whispers that survive in bloodlines, in gestures, in the faint tremor of fear that passes from parent to child without a word spoken. That is the power of forbidden history. It is never fully gone, only hidden beneath layers of deception, waiting for the brave or the damned to unearth it again. And in the case of the bride, those whispers never stopped. Her name, though stricken from church rolls and marriage registers, lingered in the margins of forgotten diaries, in the coded footnotes of medical treatises, and in the fearful avoidance of those who still lived in the village. They would not speak of her directly, but they lived in the shadow of what she represented, a collapse in the natural order, an offense that no ritual could purify. What made her story so dangerous wasn't just the horror of her vanishing. nor even the impossible birth that marked her wedding night. It was the unspoken implication that the institutions guarding morality and faith had failed to protect the sacred, failed to contain the profane, failed to explain the inexplicable. When the world sees that its guardians falter, terror spreads faster than plague. People begin to suspect that their devotion was misplaced, that their obedience was exploited, that the ones demanding silence were complicit. And so, the bride became not just a scandal, but a threat to authority itself. To erase her was to restore control, but fragments remained, and when examined, they reveal something chilling. She was not alone. Records smuggled out of parish archives decades later describe similar incidents across Europe. Brides who disappeared, infants delivered in secrecy, and families that swore blood oaths to silence. It was not a single event, but a pattern, spread across centuries like an infection that resurfaced when vigilance waned. These files were never meant for public eyes. They were written as warnings to bishops and abbots, instructing them in containment, burial, and denial. The rituals described were not blessings, but weapons, invocations against what they called the child of the Second Covenant. What was this covenant? What did they believe had been broken or renewed by these impossible births? The deeper I studied, the more I saw the same signs repeated. References to rivers running black, to lamps extinguishing at the altar, to voices chanting in unknown tongues during midnight prayers. These are not accidents. These were signals, omens that the guardians recognized but never confessed to the laity. They knew something older than the church had clawed its way through, and they feared that admitting it would unravel faith itself. And so the story of the bride was bound, gagged, and buried. But those who live too close to her village still swear that at certain hours, when the bells are muffled by fog, a woman's cry echoes across the fields. Not grief, not terror, but something more primal, more commanding, as if the land itself still remembers her unfinished vow. Once you accept that the bride was part of a pattern, the next question becomes far more dangerous. What was trying to come through her? The church records never say it plainly, but the language is unmistakable. They speak of the unwed covenant, of a lineage that renews itself in shadow, of infants who are not fully bound to flesh. In the writings of the Dominican Inquisitor François Bellecourt, a passage survives that hints at the truth. These children bear no past, only a demand. They come with eyes that remember what men have forgotten, and they do not hunger as men hunger. It was not merely an anomaly of flesh, not merely a scandal of the bedroom. It was a challenge to the hierarchy of creation itself. If children could be born outside the chain of blood and bone, if vows of matrimony could serve as a gate rather than a bond, then the entire architecture of power collapsed. Kings, priests, fathers, their authority rested on lineage, inheritance, and sanctity. But what happens when something greater bypasses all of that and simply enters, unbidden? The bride child, the one delivered in secret and seen only by trembling witnesses, was described in medical notes that should never have survived. His skin, they said, was pale beyond pale, as if it had never felt the sun. His breathing was irregular, sometimes halting, yet he never cried. His eyes opened within minutes, not days, and he gazed upon the midwives with what they described as a terrible awareness, as if judging rather than learning. The records stop abruptly after that. The child was removed, taken by men in clerical black who recorded nothing of his fate. He too was erased. But silence is never total. 2 years later, on the far side of the continent, in a monastery near the Alps, rumors spread of a boy who walked the cloisters at night, not casting a shadow. His presence drove the monks to insomnia, and several left the order entirely, convinced the child was a curse. The monastery burned mysteriously that winter, with only the boy unaccounted for. The connection is circumstantial, yes. But if you follow the pattern of erasures, of fires, of vanished records, you begin to see the invisible hand that moves behind them. The bride may have disappeared, but her child did not vanish with her. He became the living proof of what the authorities wanted buried. a flesh-and-blood contradiction, a demand that could not be silenced by prayer or fire. And if one child survived, if one legacy escaped the purge, then the question is not whether her bloodline continues, but how many times it has crossed into ours without us ever knowing. There comes a moment when forbidden history shifts from theory into something heavier. Not myth, not whisper, but presence. That moment arrives when you realize that the bride's story was not isolated, not buried in some provincial graveyard of forgotten scandals. It spread like a contagion, infiltrating families, lineages, dynasties. The more I traced, the more I saw names recurring in strange places, names of noble houses that rose too quickly, merchants whose fortunes arrived from nowhere, clergy who ascended without proper ordination. Behind their sudden rise was always a gap in their genealogy, a void where the parentage of a child was either falsified or missing entirely. That is how forbidden blood travels, unseen, but always upward, always toward power. Think about it. The church, the crown, the secret societies that fed on both. They had one goal above all, to regulate inheritance. Control over bloodlines meant control over land, armies, wealth. If a new kind of child, one untethered from the predictable chains of human descent, began to appear, it threatened the very foundation of that control. Which means the bride was not just a woman who broke nature. She was a doorway through which power itself entered history without permission. The villagers who lived in the ruins of her name said it plainly, though they did not understand its depth. They called her child the heir without a father. And here is where you must open your mind wider than is comfortable. Because in esoteric manuscripts, the kind that were chained to monastery walls and read only in candlelit secrecy, the phrase heir without a father does not describe scandal, but divinity. It was used for kings who claimed descent not from men, but from gods, for prophets whose lives were framed as interventions from beyond flesh. It was a phrase of elevation, not of shame. And yet, when spoken of the bride's child, it carried terror, not reverence. That paradox tells us everything. This was not the birth of a savior. This was not the mythic purity the church claimed for its chosen figures. This was intrusion. An unsanctioned miracle, something that belonged to no altar, no order, no ritual of blessing. And it terrified those who lived through it, because it stripped away the illusion that sanctity and corruption were opposites. No, here they met, merged, and gave rise to a life that answered to no authority but its own. The further I followed this thread, the more I understood why the bride had to vanish. It was not to punish her. It was to protect others from what she had become, a vessel proven capable of opening the door again. And if one vessel existed, there would be others, always others. Centuries are cruel to memory, but they are kind to those who seek patterns. The trail of heirs without fathers is faint, but not erased. In 1642, in a village outside Prague, a bride collapsed at her wedding feast, her gown stained not with wine, but with blood. She gave birth before midnight, and by dawn she was gone. The child survived. His life is barely recorded, yet his name appears later as a patron of secretive guilds that controlled trade routes across Europe. No mention of his origin, no trace of his mother. Only wealth, influence, and fear wherever his presence was felt. In 1721, in France, a rural parish was burned after a midwife confessed under torture that she had delivered a child on a wedding night, a child who never cried, never suckled, but stared at her with an expression she described as older than any man. The fire consumed the church, the records, and the accused. Yet, decades later, a bishop's journal mentions an unnamed noble patron whose lineage could not be verified, though his coin carried weight enough to silence objections. And closer to our own century, the traces grow more subtle. No open scandals, no fires. Just families with too much power, too few explanations. Families whose portraits hang in gilded halls, yet whose firstborns always carry an air of distance, of separation, as though their souls do not fully belong to the world that birthed them. The bride story is not a tale locked in one night of horror. It is a lineage, a cycle, an intrusion that reemerges when men believe they have secured their control. You begin to see why the guardians fear disclosure. To admit this truth would unravel the concept of legitimacy itself. Kings would be exposed as usurpers, priests as frauds, nations as constructs built on bloodlines that were never human to begin with. And if such knowledge spread to the masses, what order could survive? Fear was the only weapon strong enough to keep the secret buried. So fear was manufactured. Superstition was encouraged. Villagers were taught to whisper of curses, to blame women, to burn midwives. Also, the real truth, that power itself had been infiltrated, would never be seen. But the truth lingers. And when you stand before certain families, when you look into the cold stillness of their heirs, you feel it in your bones. The heir without a father is not a legend. He is history's quietest conqueror. There is a moment when fear shifts into recognition, when you no longer recoil at the impossible, but begin to see the order behind it. That is where we are now. The bride who vanished, the child born without lineage, the scattered echoes across centuries. These are not isolated blasphemies. They are symptoms of a hidden system, one designed to feed power into chosen vessels while erasing the vessels themselves. And here is the cruel paradox. The very institutions that preached holiness and order became the custodians of this system, suppressing evidence not out of ignorance, but complicity. You must understand, the church thrived on mystery, but it feared chaos. When a child like hers appeared, it could not be publicly embraced, for that would unravel the careful narrative of divine order. Yet privately, these births offered something the guardians craved, access to a force beyond nature. So they hid what they could not destroy, bending the anomaly into silence, while quietly drawing from its influence. The records that survived in secret do not read like condemnations, but like manuals. They do not say banish this. They say contain, harness, study. And when you read between the lines, you see the truth. The bride was not erased simply for scandal. She was erased because she proved the door could open without their permission. Her vanishing was not punishment. It was sequestration. They needed her gone so they could hold the key themselves, decide who would open the door, when and why. Think of every coronation, every marriage uniting dynasties, every ritual hidden behind veils of incense and chant. What if some were not mere ceremonies of tradition, but reenactments designed to replicate what happened to her? The bride becomes not just a forgotten woman, but the template for a ritual too dangerous to admit. A ritual disguised as marriage, designed to bridge flesh and something else. And this explains the cold truth that lingers in certain families. Those who inherit power inherit more than wealth. They inherit the silence of their origin, a silence purchased by vanished women, women like her, who became vessels and then were erased. To look upon the heirs of this silence is to stare into the legacy of the forbidden covenant itself. Imagine the horror of the villagers when they realized none of this was accident. Imagine their terror when the fires, the screams, the disappearances began to look less like divine punishment and more like human orchestration. They had been taught that evil came from outside, that corruption was the devil's intrusion. But the patterns revealed otherwise. Evil was manufactured, controlled, used. The villagers whispered of shadows gathering near the manor on certain nights, of cloaked men arriving when the moon was veiled. They saw carriages without crests, carrying strangers whose faces were never glimpsed in daylight. And they began to piece it together. The bride was not destroyed, she was taken. Taken by those who needed her blood, her womb, her ability to open the forbidden door. In their silence, the villagers confirmed what the guardians feared most, that she was never the last, only the first they had seen with their own eyes. The more I followed the scattered documents, the clearer it became. The child of that wedding night was not a mistake. He was an achievement, a creation that proved human flesh could be bent into a conduit for something greater, something unchained from time and inheritance. And once you prove the door can open, you do not close it. You open it again, and again, and again. That is why the language changes in the records. At first, they describe horror, scandal, blasphemy. But later, they describe process. Formula. The union of vow and intrusion. The binding of innocence to secrecy. Cold, calculated words that strip away fear and replace it with methodology. They had taken what happened to the bride and codified it into practice. And so, the world you walk in, the governments, the banks, the gilded cathedrals, all shimmer with the residue of her vanished night. They are not built merely on labor, conquest, and gold. They are built on her silence, and the silence of those like her. That is why when you look into the hollow eyes of certain rulers, certain heirs, you sense something off. You are not imagining it. You are seeing what survived when the rest was burned away. There's a question most never dare ask. If the bride was taken, if her child survived, what became of her bloodline? The whispers suggest something both more intimate and more terrifying than anyone wants to accept. She did not simply disappear into ashes or bones. She was folded into a hidden network, bound to a cycle where her body was never her own again. Women like her were not erased because they failed, but because they succeeded. They had proven themselves vessels. And once proven, they were never allowed to walk free. The archives are clear in their silences. Entire convents where the records end abruptly. Boarding schools for girls that closed overnight, with no explanation. These were not accidents. They were harvests. Places where potential brides were studied, prepared, chosen, and if successful, erased. What is worse is the continuity. The institutions behind this did not collapse with kingdoms or revolutions. They adapted. When monarchies fell, they dressed as bankers. When faith weakened, they cloaked themselves in science. When one mask cracked, they donned another. But the ritual remained unbroken, always seeking the next bride, the next impossible birth. And this continuity has consequences. It means the world we know, the rulers who seem untouchable, the families who command wealth beyond comprehension, the bloodlines that never thin, all of them may trace back to that same moment of intrusion. The bride's night was not an accident of nature. It was a prototype. In every generation since, they have perfected the ritual, each time erasing the vessel, each time keeping only the air. This is why her story chills deeper than any ghost tale or legend. It is not about death. It is about control. A control so total that it rewrites memory, erases names, and replaces them with dynasties that reign in silence. When you ask, where did this family come from? How they rise so quickly? You are not looking at fortune. You are looking at inheritance, but not the inheritance of men. The villagers knew in their bones. That is why they fell silent. Not because they did not know the truth, but because the truth was unbearable. She was never lost to them. She was recycled, absorbed, used until she ceased to be a person at all, and became instead a mechanism, a key that opened the door between flesh and what waited beyond. The deeper you trace these threads, the more you sense how much has been hidden in plain sight. Take the heraldry of certain noble houses. Coats of arms that show brides crowned not with veils, but with serpents or infants cradled by winged beasts. Scholars will tell you these are symbols of triumph, metaphors of fertility or vigilance. But those who know the forbidden histories recognize the marks, echoes of the covenant that was never meant for public eyes. Even in the language of ritual, the traces remain. Marriage vows that once spoke of union under God contain archaic phrases no longer explained. Let no man divide what is sealed this night. Through you, the promise enters the world. To most, they are poetic flourishes. But in manuscripts hidden from congregations, these same words are instructions, formulas for turning a ceremony of love into a vessel of intrusion. The bride is not simply wed. She is opened. And perhaps the most damning evidence lies in the secrecy of childbirth itself. For centuries, childbirth was hidden behind locked doors, attended only by women, veiled in pain and blood and silence. Why? not simply because of modesty, as they would have us believe. It was because sometimes something else came through. Something that could not be explained, could not be baptized, could not be acknowledged in daylight. To keep the illusion of order, they locked the doors. And if the impossible happened, they ensured that only the expendable saw it. Midwives, servants, the poor. Those who could be silenced without consequence. The bride story is not myth because it is too strange. It is myth because it is too familiar. It has been retold in fragments across continents, rewritten as legend, fairy tale, and superstition. But all these stories share the same root. The woman taken, the child unnatural, the silence that follows. And when you realize this, when you stare past the illusions, you begin to see it everywhere. It is not one village, not one century. It is the spine of power itself, a secret architecture of intrusion and erasure. And so we return to her, not forgotten, not lost, but multiplied through time. The bride who delivered a child on her wedding night and vanished was not a singular horror. She was the first glimpse of an empire that wears veils darker than any cathedral shadow. Now you must face the most unbearable truth. The bride's disappearance was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of ours. Every system you trust, every institution you obey, every altar before which men kneel, they are shaped by her vanishing. She is the unspoken cornerstone, the silent mother of an empire that pretends it was born of reason, of divine right, of order. But its true origin was terror. Terror harnessed, repeated, perfected until it became indistinguishable from governance itself. Think of the dynasties that never die, of the fortunes that cannot be explained, of the names that echo across centuries without thinning. Do you truly believe they survived on merit? On divine favor? No. They survived because they were never truly human in the first place. They were seeded, infiltrated, and multiplied by the covenant she revealed. The bride's womb was not only a scandal, it was a portal. And every time her story was repeated, erased, and buried, the portal widened until it no longer needed secrecy. It only needed silence. And this silence is our inheritance. We walk in cities built on erased names. We kneel in churches where the walls hum with the residue of rituals never spoken of. We elect leaders whose ancestors rose not from effort, but from intrusion. And all of it traces back to her, to the woman who delivered a child on her wedding night and vanished, leaving the world forever altered. So when you hear the old stories, the bride stolen by spirits, the woman who vanishes after childbirth, the infant left at the church steps with no lineage, know this: they are not myths. They are confessions, wrapped in fable, softened for ears too weak to bear the truth. The truth is darker. The truth is heavier. The truth is that she did not vanish. She multiplied. There comes a moment when the listener feels the veil thinning, when the words no longer sound like history, but like accusation. That moment is now. Because if the bride's story was not isolated, if her child was not destroyed, if the ritual was not abandoned, then you must face the question that has stalked every generation in silence. How close has this intrusion come to you? The villagers believed they could escape by burying memory, but blood cannot be buried. It seeps. It moves from cradle to cradle, vow to vow, until centuries later it lives in faces that no longer remember its source. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth, that those who carry it do not know what they are. Look at the world around you. Leaders whose voices command nations without effort, whose eyes seem colder than flesh should allow. Families whose influence stretches beyond borders, whose wealth multiplies without origin. They are not accidents of fortune. They are inheritors. They are the children of silence. And when you stand before them, in their portraits, in their speeches, in the stillness of their gaze, you feel it. A distance, a coldness, the same absence of shadow whispered of in the monastery that burned, the same unbroken stare described by trembling midwives, the same signature that traces back to the bride herself, but does not end in gilded halls. It does not remain with kings and financiers. It spreads downward, into bloodlines that touched theirs, into villages that unknowingly harbored their heirs. And so the question becomes unavoidable. How much of this has passed into us? Into you? Into the very marrow of the people watching these words? That is the silence they enforced with fire, with torture, with erasure. Not to protect you from blasphemy, to protect themselves from the recognition that their intrusion had already taken root in every corner of the world. You must understand, the Forbidden Covenant is not history. It is inheritance. And the moment you realize that, the moment you allow the possibility to live in your mind, you cannot unknow it. You cannot close the door. It will follow you. The way her cry followed the fog across her village fields. The way her vanished name still trembles beneath the surface of every archive, every burned page, every gilded crest. The villagers, the priests, the doctors, they thought silence could contain it. They thought fire could erase it. But silence does not erase. Fire does not consume memory. Silence preserves. Fire seals. That is why her story lingers, why it emerges centuries later in fragments that align too precisely to ignore. And it is why you are hearing it now. You are not meant to hear it. You're not meant to carry it. But once it enters you, it changes you. That is the curse of forbidden knowledge. It cannot be possessed without also possessing you. So here's the last veil I will tear. The bride who delivered a child on her wedding night did not simply vanish into history. She became history. Every institution that silenced her built its strength on her absence. Every dynasty that thrived without explanation carried her blood. Every ritual that bound men to obedience was a shadow of the ritual performed upon her. She was not forgotten. She was multiplied, disguised, embedded into the bones of the world itself. And the silence that surrounds her is the same silence that surrounds you now. When you look at your own life, your own family, your own inheritance, do you truly know where it begins? Do you know what shadows touched your blood before you were born? Do you know whose vow, whose erasure, whose silence paved the way for your existence? That is the final terror you cannot answer. And the guardians have ensured you never will. But listen carefully. That silence you feel now, the weight in your chest, the pull in your thoughts, it is not emptiness. It is recognition. It is the faint echo of a vow whispered long before you were born, a vow sealed on a wedding night that ended in screams and silence. You are closer to her than you realize. You have to understand what happens now is not a sequel, but a sealing. For centuries, they thought erasure equaled containment. That if they burned the pages, broke the seals, and buried the women under saints and lies, the wound would close. They were wrong. The wound is not on paper or stone. It is a pattern. It moves like water through the bones of nations, cool and inevitable. Tonight, I close this chain where it began for you, but I do not end it. I leave it as a burden and a choice. Listen closely, because the last thing I will say is not an ending. It is an instruction. When the bride's shadow fused with the air and the sealed wing surrendered its secrets, something changed irreversibly. The covenant stopped being a ritual confined to a room with candles and an oath. It became a law written into flesh. The heir, now complete, carried within him not only authority, but permission. Permission to reach beyond boundaries, to pull what lay folded in the dark into the map of the world. His voice was no longer his alone. It echoed through corporations, through courts, through parliaments. It turned allegiances into obedience and families into archives. Those who had once trafficked in secrecy learned to traffic in legacy. They stowed her memory in treasuries and learned to wield the absence as a blade. No one noticed the blade until it had already been sharpened. What they could not foresee was what we can now see plainly when we stop pretending ignorance is comfort. The bride's sacrifice, voluntary or forced, it matters less now than you think, became the pattern's prototype. The vessel yields its seed. The seed becomes heir. The heir becomes gate. Gatekeepers multiplied. The more gates they forged, the more their influence diffused until the world's most ordinary institutions hummed with the residue of that night. Commerce, law, education, marriage itself. Each carried a filament of the covenant, a tiny code that made obedience habitual and curiosity dangerous. And that is why certain doors are always locked, why certain genealogies cannot be traced, why the names of some mothers will never surface in respectable registries. They were never lost to chance. They were folded into systems that preferred ghosts to questions. Those who benefit never speak. Those who remember do not survive. The silence became the mechanism of survival. In silence, the heirs persisted. In silence, the world turned as they required. Yet silence is brittle when tested by voice. Eleanor, by resisting even a moment, proved that truth cannot be perfectly contained. She became a crack that widened with every whisper, every forbidden journal entry smuggled out in a priest's confession, every midwife who dared to name what she saw before her throat closed. Once the crack appears, collections of carefully curated amnesia stop functioning. Patterns show through. You begin to notice the same faces behind different altars, the same eyes in portraits centuries apart. You begin to understand that inheritance is less about blood and more about authorization. The right to exist in front of law, behind a name nobody questions. So what happens to a world where the right to exist is given to those who carry this other legacy? It consolidates. It contains power in fewer hands and then disguises those hands with rituals and charities, with universities and foundations, with memorials that hide as much as they display. The heirs walk corridors of marble, and inside their pockets are the names of women nobody remembers. The fabric of your everyday life is stitched with their silence. This is the final lesson, and it is necessary and merciless. Knowledge changes the equilibrium. Once you know that vows can be gates and births can be instruments of accession, you can no longer take any ceremony at face value. You can no longer let ritual act as camouflage for extraction. To stand in ignorance is to consent to being a ledger entry in someone else's account. To remember is to be dangerous. To speak is to be a threat to the architecture built from her absence. If you keep listening, if you keep remembering, you will find yourself altered. That is the burden and the offer. I will not coddle you with false safety. Forbidden history never offers absolution. It offers agency. You can use it to recognize the patterns that bind you, to read the creases in a family tree and see the edits, the blanks, the sudden fortunes and silent mothers. You can choose to refuse the compulsion of inherited obedience. You can decide to pass on this memory, or you can let it fall into the same black hole where they stored her name. Before I let this tale become another parchment sealed away, I need you to do one thing that will mark you among the witnesses. It is a small, symbolic act, a defiance as old as speech. Share this in the world not as spectacle, but as a vow. Subscribe to the voice that tells hard truths. Comment the single word that binds you to this secret with hands that will not wring it into gossip. Remember, then share this with someone you choose. A person whose silence you trust to hold weight, whose curiosity you trust not to weaponize. Subscribe, comment, share, not as routine, but as ritual, a quiet conspiracy of memory. Promise me, and promise her, that at least one person will not allow her night to be erased again. Remember, the bride did not simply vanish. She opened something. It walked into the world, dressed now in law and lineage and the quiet of vaults. If you want to live beyond being only a ledger entry, keep this story close and pass it with care. This is not a call to panic. It is a call to witness. It is the only weapon that endures against a system built from silence. Subscribe, comment, remember. Share this with one soul who will hold the knowledge like a key. Keep it secret enough to protect it from predators, loud enough to break the pattern. Carry the weight. Let the silence that was forced upon her become the sound that frees us.